Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Steak Diane. That's right, there was a time back in the day when cooking tableside in restaurants was all the rage. And this amazing steak was probably the most famous and delicious recipe from that era. And it really was an exciting and glamorous way to eat, but unfortunately, not every restaurant was that great executing the flambé step. And after several situations involving guests running around the dining room on fire, this once popular trend flamed out, literally. But the good news is this recipe adapts beautifully to the home kitchen, as you're about to see. So let's go ahead and get started with the meat. And for this, we're going to want a couple nice tender steaks. And what I'm using is a couple perfectly trimmed pieces of beef tenderloin that I flattened out to about a ½ inch thick. And if you can swing it, this is my recommendation for the best cut to use because it's so buttery tender. But if you are looking for something a little more affordable, top sirloin will work beautifully here. And I believe traditionally what was most commonly used. But regardless of what cut of steak you use, we're going to want to season that generously on both sides with kosher salt and freshly ground black pepper. And we really do want this perfectly trimmed. Okay, you're going to see a little bit of internal marbling fat, but any external chunks of fat or membranes have been removed. And ideally this meat has been cut, butterflied, or pounded to about a ½ inch thick. And then what we want to do once our meat has been seasoned is simply leave it out at room temperature for about 15 to 20 minutes, just to warm up a little bit. And while that's happening, we can move on to the base of our sauce, which is very simple, and starts off with a nice spoon of Dijon mustard, or a spoon of whatever your favorite mustard is, as long as your favorite mustard is Dijon. And then we're also going to want a little bit of Worcestershire sauce, but not too much. Many of the recipes I see call for 2-3 times this amount, which I believe is going to be overpowering. So we really just need a couple teaspoons here. We will also go ahead and add a little bit of tomato paste for flavor, color, and acidity. I'm also going to do a little shake of cayenne, although traditionally I believe they use a few drops of hot sauce. But that's up to you. You are, of course, the boss of this historical pan sauce. And then we will finish this off with the real secret ingredient, a ½ cup of our homemade demi-glaze. See, I told you eventually I'd show you a recipe where we could use that. But I have a confession, that's not the actual demi-glaze from our video. This is a new cheater demi-glaze I'm going to show you next week, made without veal bones. So stay tuned for that. And all we need to do is warm that up and stir it into this mixture. And relax, if you don't feel like making demi-glaze, that's fine. On the blog post, I will explain how to substitute with just some nice rich chicken broth. But anyway, we're going to stir that together, and that's going to be it for our sauce base, which is one of 3 components we're going to need to finish this dish. The other 2 being some cognac, or brandy, which we'll use to produce a potentially dangerous fireball, as well as some heavy cream. And once we have all that set, we can head over to the stove to start cooking our steaks. And we will do that over very high heat and a little bit of vegetable oil. So we'll drizzle in some oil and let that get very hot until we see sort of the first wisp of smoke, at which point we will transfer our steaks in. And once that's been accomplished, what we'll do is add a few chunks of cold butter here and there, and that's going to mix in with our already very hot oil. And what we'll get this way is that nice nutty brown butter flavor without the potential of the off flavor of burned butter. Okay, sometimes if you add it at the beginning, there's a chance it can go too far. So to avoid that, we can just add that right with the steak. And then all we want to do here is sear that meat for about 2 to 3 minutes per side to get a little bit of browning on it. But we do not want to cook these steaks all the way through. Okay, what we're going to do is sear these well, but keep them rare. And then we'll finish cooking them in the finished sauce, which is much easier to control. And really, that's the only major difference between this version and the classic tableside restaurant version. They would have just added everything to the pan and sort of timed it so the steaks finished cooking right exactly when the sauce was perfect, which is pretty easy to do if you've practiced like 1,000 times. But for us home cooks, removing the meat and finishing the sauce first is much easier. So once our steaks are nicely seared, but still fairly rare, we will remove those to a plate, reduce our heat to medium, and add a nice big spoon of finely minced shallots to the pan, which could be finely minced onions. But they do carry shallots at pretty much any decent grocery store, so try to find them if you can. And what we're going to do is cook those shallots on medium heat for about 2 to 3 minutes, just until they start to soften up a little bit. And don't be alarmed, but that fond at the bottom of the pan is hopefully going to darken up nicely. And it always looks much darker on camera than it really is. But don't be afraid, that's really what we want, as you'll see when we deglaze, which is the next and by far most dangerous and exciting step. So what we'll do once we've cooked our shallots a little bit, we will turn off our heat, and if your guests are watching, dim the lights. We will pour in our cognac or brandy, at which point we can ignite this with a fireplace lighter, and voila, a giant show-stopping fireball. Which, by the way, is completely for show and not necessary. So I'll explain why on the blog you don't need to do that. But of course, off the record, I hope you do, safely. And by the way, if you want pictures, you better move fast. because those pyrotechnics are only going to last a few seconds. And once that alcohol burns off, the mixture in your pan should look something like this. And at this point, it's safe to turn our heat back on to high, and we can pour in that sauce base we mixed up earlier. And eventually, in a couple minutes, that's going to come up to a boil, and we'll give that a stir, at which point we'll let it cook for just a couple minutes, just to reduce it slightly, before adding in our heavy cream. And yes, if you're thinking, man, I bet creme fraiche would be really good in this, you are correct, that would be fantastic. But this time I'm just using regular heavy cream, which still produces a pan sauce that's beyond amazing. So we will stir that in and we'll continue cooking on high until the sauce just starts to thicken up, along with, of course, any accumulated juices. I mean, I hope this doesn't sound too harsh, but if you're the kind of person that throws away accumulated juices, we can't be friends. I'm sorry, those have to be added back in. And what we'll do is we'll continue cooking on high until our sauce starts to thicken up. So what I'm going for is something that looks just about like this. All right, it's not too thick, but it's starting to get there. And what we'll do once it reaches that point is add our meat back in and reduce our heat to low. All right, you generally don't want to boil meat, so we want to finish this off on a nice gentle simmer. So we'll add our steaks back in along with, again, any accumulated juices. And basically, as soon as that meat is heated through and cooked to our desired level of doneness, we are ready to eat. And of course, because we're not crazy, we're going to taste this before we serve it. So I sampled a little bit of sauce, which was incredible, but it did need another pinch of salt. So I stirred that in. And once that sauce is tasted and looking exactly like you want, and that beef is done to our liking, we are ready to serve. And I'm not using any thermometer, by the way. As soon as that meat goes from mushy to sort of springing back, it's usually perfectly pink. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and transfer that onto a hot plate and spoon over copious amounts of our mind-blowing sauce. And by the way, on the plate, I featured a very popular side dish of the time, which was generally never a side dish. All right, you could order some potatoes and vegetables separately, but they were almost never on the plate. The plate generally just contained your meat and some ridiculous garnish, like a piece of bright red candied apple, or crinkle-cut pickled beet, or maybe, like in my case, a hand-carved tomato rose. But anyway, we're going to serve that up and maybe finish off with a little bit of fresh chive, and that's it. Our steak Diane is done and ready to enjoy. And great news, we don't have to let this rest. Let's just go ahead and dig right in. And as great as that looks, it tastes like 100 times better. Just intensely savory with just a little bit of tang, just a little bit of sweetness from the cognac, and just the right amount of richness from that heavy cream. So I just absolutely loved how this came out. To me, this is just the quintessential American pan sauce, and almost a tragedy that you don't see this on more menus. But that's okay, because as you saw, this is pretty easy to make at home. Oh, and by the way, in case you're wondering, nobody really knows why this is called Steak Diane. There are theories it may have something to do with the goddess of the hunt, or possibly a special lady friend of the chef that invented it. But since nobody knows for sure, I'm going to end this video by officially announcing that I plan on changing the name of this to Steak Pauline, in honor of my mother, the late great Pauline Mitzowich, who I think would have really liked this, and who may have even had this cooked tableside for her back in the day in New York City. So I'm going to go see what kind of paperwork I have to fill out for that. But in the meantime, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy